Hi, welcome back. So now that we've gone through the introduction to this section, we're going to start learning a little bit about the Git process or workflow, how it all connects together, where it starts, where it finishes, and everything in between. Sorry about that. So we're also going to be learning a little bit of the terminology behind Git. So we're going to be learning about repositories, working directories, local repositories. We're going to learn all of that in this video before we move on to start using the commands. So firstly, I'm just going to give a little introduction to how Git works through from the start to finish. So before Git tracks the change, so before you commit the change to your source control, it goes through a long chain of operations and tasks. So it does a lot of things, and you need to do a lot of things before you manage to get that snapshot in time in your source control. So like I said here, many of these tasks are user controlled. You need to do them and you need to manually input them in order for Git to work properly. So before we move on to some of the processes, let's just talk about repositories for a second. So I've used this term interchangeably with directories in the past, but they are completely different things. So repositories usually refer to the data storage that stores the full history and source control of a project. So it stores all of the changes and progress of the project over time. So these repositories can be either hosted locally, so on your machine, or they could be hosted on a shared server. So for example, GitHub, that's one of the most common uses of a remote repository or a shared server repository. So like I said here, most repositories are stored on GitHub, and then core contributors, people who work on the project, will actually make copies of these repositories on their local machines and using the push and pull system. So they basically take information and put it back into the repository. They don't store the central repository on their machine. They keep it on an external server, and then they simply interact with it from there. So the term for these shared server repositories are called remote repositories, and the repositories that you store on your machine are called local repositories. I'm sure it makes sense. Remote repository meaning that it's stored somewhere else. It's remote. So there you go. Let's talk about repositories or repos versus directories. So repositories are timelines of the entire project. Like I said, they track all of the changes from start to finish. Whereas directories are usually referring to the project in its current state in time. They're usually called the working directory, but usually when people refer to the directory of a project, they're referring to the project at its current state. Whereas the repository has the full timeline of the project, from when you created the first file to when you just created the 100th file and your millionth line of code. Of course, that's an unrealistic example, but you're kind of seeing what I'm saying here. So technically, any directory that has source control installed on it is a repository itself, but it's better to call these local repositories, as I said in the previous slide, because usually they are stored on some sort of shared server and you interact with them. So that's what most people do, is they store them on GitHub, for example, and they simply pull and push from that repository. So anything that's stored on your machine, any repositories, directories, are usually called local repositories. So now that we know a little bit about what repositories are, let's talk about this workflow diagram here. So I know it looks a little bit complicated, but I'm going to go through each step and explain what it does. So we start with the working directory. This is your project at its current state in time, as we just explained. It contains all of your files, everything at its current state, so when you're working on it. So let's just say you made a new file, called it, let's just say script.py, for example, a Python script. Let's just say you added this and you wrote some code in that script. So now you want to change or take this and take a snapshot of it and put it in your source control and say, okay, I made a new file called script.py and I added 10 lines of code to it. So the first thing you do is obviously make the changes, but then after that, what do? Do you just automatically write some code or put some command in the terminal and it just does everything for you? No, you actually have to do a few things before that. So there's this thing before you commit. It's called the staging area, and a commit is just pretty much taking a snapshot and putting it in source control. So we're going to be calling it commit from now on. So before you make your commit, there's this thing called the staging area. And what the staging area does is when you commit, it takes all of the files, modifications, all of the changes listed, and it takes this, bundles it up, and puts it in the commit. So for example, in the staging area right now, we added a file called script.py, we modified the file, and let's just say we removed 10 lines from our HTML website. So it would have, we added a script.py, we added 10 lines to this, so we modified it, and we removed or modified our website.html file. Let's just say that, 3 modifications. Now you can add and remove from this staging area. It's asynchronous, so you can take and remove as much as you want before you commit. It's not like as soon as you add, you commit. That's a completely separate step. So let's just say that you do this and all of that, but let's just say you don't want to track, or you don't want to you added a script.py file inside your commit. So let's just say you don't want to put it in that snapshot. So what you would do is remove it from the staging area. And we're going to talk about adding and removing files and doing all of that in the future videos, but that's what you do. So you would keep going through this back and forth cycle. And once you have the files, all of the files, modifications that you want, you would commit your changes with a command, and it would put them in the local repository. So this is what I wanted to talk about, the local and remote repository. So pretend that this is your repo stored on GitHub. So this is going to be your central storage. And before that, what you would do at the start of each session is pull all of the information from your remote repository and make a direct copy of it on your local machine. Now, once you made all the changes, so let's just say you make 10 commits over the course of 4 hours. Now, it's a little bit unrealistic, but that's not what we're talking about here. So you've clearly changed the local repository. We've made a bunch of changes, and right now the remote and local repositories don't match. So now what you would do is, okay, I'm done for the day. I made all my commits. You would then push it to the remote repository, and now they're both matched up. And you would continue this cycle until your project is finished or until you don't want to work on it anymore, pulling and pushing and staging area and making commits. And overall, it just goes through this cycle until you don't want to work on your project anymore. So you can see that Git has a much more complex workflow than other source control. And of course, it's mostly the same, but it's a little bit complex. You have to go through adding things to the staging area, then committing it, then putting on our remote repository. And for now, we're not actually going to use any push and pull or remote repositories. Well, we're just going to use one local repository. But for the future, when you learn all of the different features of Git and remote repositories, it is better to follow this model, because if you store it locally, you miss out on a lot of opportunities. I mean, it is possible to add, collaborations with others, but it's better if you put it on GitHub because you're missing out on a lot of opportunity. And on top of that, it's much safer to put it on somewhere like GitHub in case of, let's just say your hard drive gets damaged, for example, and your local repository is gone, finished. And there's been a lot of stories of people who work, years on projects and they're on their local repository, and then their hard drive gets damaged or maybe, gets burned out or something like that, and they lose all of their work. So once we get to that stage, we're going to put everything on a remote repository, and I'm going to teach you about following this model exactly. But for now, you just need to know about this part. So forget about the remote repository and push and pull. We just need to know that from there, you make changes, you modify the staging area. So what you want added, you take a snapshot and you put it in your repository, and you repeat over and over again until you're finished. So that's all I wanted you to take away from this video, just to know a little bit about how Git works, the processes that take place in order for Git to work. So in the next few videos, we're going to be working towards learning some of these commands. So for example, adding and removing from the staging area, committing. We're going to learn about interacting with our repository. We're going to do all of that in this section. And then we're going to move on to our remote repositories, where we start working on interacting with GitHub. All right, let's move on.